Thanks for joining us for this session. We're continuing our theme on Passive House plus renewables equals net zero, something we've been talking about for the last several months, and we're going to keep talking about this year. Tonight's topic is really zeroing in on the renewables piece of it. We had a lot of sessions talking about Passive House first and why Passive House is so critical to this equation. Tonight, we're going to talk about what happens now that you reduce energy use so efficiently with Passive House. What do you do about that renewables piece? So we're going to solve that puzzle a bit tonight. At least we'll attempt to solve it. So for those who are new to these sessions and haven't been seeing them last couple months, you can watch the recordings of all of our previous sessions online. So on the Passive House Mass Video Library, you can go to our website, phmass.org, to find those. But we've been talking about this public campaign to raise awareness around the role of Passive House in achieving net zero energy. We believe it's a critical component to net zero energy buildings and a necessary one at that in order to reduce the energy demand significantly enough to hit these net zero goals. And we believe Passive House really is the platform for net zero, not only because it reduces energy use so much, but it also because it provides the quality assurance, the third-party verification, all these critical components of assuring that our abilities perform as designed. So join us each month here, just as you are now. We'll be doing these the next several months leading up to a symposium in the fall. We're targeting late October, early November. Hopefully we'll have word coming soon about the actual date. And hopefully we'll be able to invite you to join us in person for this special symposium in the fall. But we'll have information about that coming soon. All right, sorry. So I want to be a couple things before I turn over to the main topic tonight. But I want something we've been talking about the last couple months. Folks who have been joining us will know this, but the EEAC, the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council here in Massachusetts, has been drafting their new statewide energy efficiency plan. They do this every 3 years. The current plan ends this year. So the draft 3-year plan will start at the beginning of next year, 2022. They have just recently, in the last month or so, released a draft version of this plan. And they're open now for comments, for public comments on this draft plan. Passive House Massachusetts, along with other organizations, submitted a lot of recommendations that were in various ways incorporated into this draft. And now is our time to comment on those. So we're asking you folks to make comments as you can. You can find out all sorts of information on our website, phmass.com/policy. But the main takeaways are that they are holding public comment in-person sessions, in-person in quotes. They're doing these virtually over Zoom, Wednesday, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., and then next Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. These are sessions you can attend virtually and make your comments in person to the EEAC. You can also make comments, written comments through email to this email address here on the screen. You can find out all the information about this on our website, phmass.com/policy, as I mentioned. And you can also see the comments that we've submitted. So you can see the proposals that we made to the EEAC. You can read them. You can see the EEAC's draft plan. But we're asking folks to make comments simply in support of the Passive House initiatives. You can get as specific as you like. And honestly, in some cases, just being general is the most important thing. Just saying that you support the Passive House initiatives, you want to see them continue and see them expand. So go to the policy section for more information on that. If anybody can attend tomorrow's session in person, please do that as well. Other upcoming events to make you aware of. So this week is the North American Passive House Networks Conference. They're doing a hybrid conference. So if you're not already traveling down to New York to attend it, you can attend it virtually, which is what I'll be doing. But you can find out, you'll see a link on our website or just Google for it. But go to that one, a lot of great Passive House information. And then we're putting on a Passive House builder and construction workshop as part of the Mass Save Passive House training program well, I'm going to say the end of this month, but July 1st. You can register for that on our website as well. So those are the things that I wanted to brief everyone on before we get started, but we got a lot of people here. We got a lot of our speakers. I think we're ready to get things going. So this is our program for the evening. You can see our speakers listed here. We're really excited. Welcome Tom Chase, Julie Klum, Abby Ramanan, and Isaac Baker. It's going to be an excellent session talking all about the renewables piece of the Passive House plus renewables equals net zero equation. I'm going to turn my screen off here and welcome Tom Chase from New Ecology and from the Passive House Massachusetts board to kick things off. All right.
Great. Thanks, Aaron, and hi, everybody. Looking forward to hearing from Julie and Abby and Isaac. So I'm going to be brief. and just give some food for thought to set some context around why we're talking renewables, what renewables means in the context of the passive house plus renewables equals net zero equation. So let me share my screen. So really re-emphasizing what Aaron said in his introduction on the importance of efficiency first, and really efficiency first in terms of driving down site energy use and source energy so that we maximize our renewables investment. We really want to get the most out of that investment as possible, and that starts with reducing source energy with passive house. So just a quick primer. So source energy is site energy plus the losses from production, distribution, and transmitting that energy to your site. And there are some real key strategies. This is just a few that I found useful. There are many others, but in terms of thinking about getting your source energy down with your design prior to thinking about how much renewables you need to get to net zero, these are big ones. You'll see the first three are all around ventilation. So increasing the energy recovery efficiency of ventilation has a big impact on source energy. Providing energy recovery ventilation for spaces you might not otherwise, like trash rooms, support spaces, back of house, laundry rooms. Avoiding overventilating. So ventilating certainly for health and to meet requirements for certification, but avoiding overventilating. Of course, using heat pumps in lieu of electric resistance wherever possible. And those electric resistance systems do sneak in. I'm thinking especially in larger buildings, multifamily buildings, things like heat trace, electric unit heaters, and things like that. And then offsetting site energy loads with your on-site renewables before you start to think about off-site. And we'll talk a little bit about that before we get into the meat of the presentation. So there are a lot of really current questions driving renewables deployment for passive house net zero projects, specifically in the state of Massachusetts, that I wanted to highlight. A big one right now is after you've reduced your source energy use through site improvements in your design, what counts for source energy reduction? Is a kilowatt hour that you make with an on-site solar PV system, let's say, equivalent to a kilowatt hour that you make with an off-site system that maybe you own or maybe you buy a credit from someone else? What are the relative contributions if they're not the same, and who decides? There's a lot we don't know yet, and there are a lot of moving parts around regulatory requirements that are in the works. So municipal requirements that are not finalized yet, the state's upcoming net zero stretch code, and how renewables will be counted under those. What we do know, however, are the requirements within the PHIUS rating system for PHIUS 0 projects, and the requirements in the PHI rating system for those projects that are seeking to get to net zero. And so in the context of the regulatory uncertainty, we can focus on what we do have some certainty around, which is largely related to on-site renewables generation. So here's a quick rundown of the PHIUS 0 rules. So PHIUS 0 rules specific to 2021. I wanted to focus on the system that is just landed recently and which will be undergoing forward. And what I have here is just a quick table showing the type of renewable resource, how much of the site energy, the ratio of the site energy offset by the renewable resource when you make, let's say, a kilowatt of electricity on site or off site. And then just some notes on it. So on-site renewables, think things like on-site solar PV, you get full credit for those, but only for coincident production. So only for energy that you make on site and use on site. And then the energy you send to the grid, you don't get as much credit for. Then we have 3 off-site system types. So this is directly owned within our electric grid load zone, community solar projects, and virtual power purchase agreement projects. We're sharing credits between renewable energy project sites and our building. These all require a 15-year contract under PHIUS with the renewable energy credits retired. So that can be challenging for those offsite projects. Renewable energy credits are a big part of the financing, as we'll hear, especially for solar PV, but for other types as well. And then the last renewable type is offsite green E certified renewable energy credits. The thing to notice here is that not only do you need a 20-year contract for those under PHIUS, but they only counted about a fifth of their value, energy value. So what all of this means, especially related to that REC retirement, is that the most likely candidates that we're seeing under the PHIUS zero net zero projects, PHIUS plus 2021 projects, are the on-site renewables and then the off-site green E-RECs, and less viability potentially around the off-site systems that would require renewable energy credits be retired. Under the PHI rating system, it's a little bit simpler. We have on-site renewables and off-site. They both count at a factor of 1. What PHI has within the rating system are 3 subsets of the standard: classic, plus, and premium. Each of those has a renewable energy generation requirement built into it. If you produce more than that, up to 15 kilowatt hours per square meter, you can count that against your source energy requirement. But you do still have that that baseline requirement. It's either 0, 60, or 120 kilowatt hours per square meter for the classic, plus, and premium rating systems. Again, we see that on-site systems are much more likely to be developed, largely around the economics of renewable energy credits. And so that's what we see as the most likely pathway forward. So I think that's what I have, and I want to hand it off to Julie and let her introduce a project that is all electric and looking to get to net zero itself. Let me stop sharing my screen. There we go.
All right. Julie, are you ready to go? Oh, excellent. If you're talking, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to really quickly, what I wanted to do was to just sort of show everybody a project that POA has in Boston, and we're up against sort of a gap in getting to net zero. And probably should have done this before Tom, so he could have solved my gap, but or told us how to solve the gap. But this is a project in Boston. 52 units, senior properties. We are, we've designed it to PHIUS Plus 2018, in the process of getting our pre-cert. The systems basically is a central VRF heating and cooling, semi-central ventilation system, semi-central electric domestic hot water, which is kind of rare for us. We rarely get to do electric domestic hot water. So, so this is a little bit of a stretch, but so far so good. Currently, we have a 90 kW roof mounted PV array designed for the roof. And we had before last week a solar storage product designed into the project. But we made the mistake of mentioning it to the building department, and they kind of rejected that without some more information. So, basically our challenge is that I need 150 kW to get to net zero, to get to 100%. And so we typically own the PV when we put it on a building, but for this project, we're kind of just want to look at what's out there in order to get this project to net zero, being our first all electric passive house building. So I'm going to stop share and introduce Abby from the Clean Energy Center, who's going to sort of talk to us a little bit about what they know in terms of renewables and how it relates to getting our buildings to net zero. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Julie. Let me just share my screen. Thank you all for being here tonight. I did just turn my fan off to that was cooling me off. So I'll try and keep this short because I'm going to be sweating bullets in about 5 minutes. But yeah, thank you all so much for having me here. My name's Addendum. I'm a project manager with Clean Energy Group, and I just want to touch on a bit of the work we do, and in particular, kind of what we've seen through the solar and storage projects that we've helped with implementation on, and kind of the barriers and sort of recommendations that we have kind of developed on that. So to give you a little bit of background, in case you haven't heard of Clean Energy Group, we are a national nonprofit based in Vermont, although I'm actually in Maine. And we are primarily funded by private foundations. We do have a sister organization, Clean Energy States Alliance, which is membership based and has a variety of state energy agencies. I know PHIUS is one of them who are members of that organization. And so a lot of the work that we do specifically with solar and storage in kind of critical facilities is through the Resilient Power Project. So the Resilient Power Project was founded about 8 years ago in the wake of Superstorm Sandy, where we were just seeing the impacts of power outages on particularly low income and under-resourced communities. You know, it's just so valuable and important to have resilient power that can provide backup during an outage. And so we founded the Resilient Power Project, mostly through, again, foundation funding, to really increase the amount of projects, solar and storage projects that could impact low-income communities. And in particular, we do a lot of that through offering technical assistance funds. You'll hear me talk about this a lot tonight. But we offer funding for providing pre-development feasibility analyses on solar and storage for critical facilities that serve under-resourced communities. In addition to that, we do a lot of sort of capacity building and resource providing a lot of resources, including a lot of the reports that you can see on your screen here. We just released actually a few weeks ago, 2 really, really comprehensive reports. They're very long and deep. They're not meant to be read all in one go, but they're 2 reports on connected solutions, which is, as many of you may know, a great program you all have in Massachusetts that in particular incentivizes battery storage. So I think all of you probably at this point know kind of the primary benefits of solar and storage, or renewables and storage, but I'm primarily going to focus on solar and storage because that's what we do a lot of. But kind of what we've heard communicated to us as why a lot of critical facilities want to pursue solar and storage are kind of can be divided up into these 4 categories. So, you know, primarily electric bill cost savings are always going to be hugely important for any critical service provider. In affordable housing, we've seen that as kind of their #1 motivation because, you know, obviously when you're operating on already very thin margins, trying to make a property, you know, financially feasible, those electric bill cost savings are going to be really incentivizing solar and storage. Otherwise, you are less likely to want to pursue it. And then again, energy resilience, we deal a lot in energy resilience, and for a lot of community facilities, you know, nonprofits, community centers, churches, folks who want to serve as a community gathering place or a resiliency hub during a power outage. That's one of their primary motivations. For a lot of those folks, the economics might be slightly different. Either because, you know, they're nonprofits, so their finances are a little different, or also they just value their resilience more. So they might be willing to, you know, pay for a bigger battery system, for example, because they value the ability to back up for longer hours or just back up a larger load. And then, you know, kind of the benefits of direct ownership of energy generation, you know, folks who don't necessarily want to be tethered to the grid or tethered to kind of the whims of utilities. You know, a lot of them will pursue kind of solar and storage for that reason. And then obviously all of us care about producing clean renewable electricity just for the benefits that provides of reducing usage of fossil fuels and improving climate opportunities. So to talk through the barriers that we've encountered, these results are from a survey we sent out a few months ago now to about 60 critical service providers. So this includes folks in affordable housing, municipalities, fire stations and other emergency services, and then also community service providers, so community centers, churches, and, you know, kind of other sort of community facilities like that. And we really these are all folks who we interacted with primarily through the technical assistance funds we provide, on solar and storage projects. So almost all of them had already pursued implementing a solar and storage project, at least one, but some of those were more successful than others. And that's kind of what we wanted to get into with this survey. And we shared the broader results of the survey in a report that's available on our website called Overcoming Barriers to Solar and Storage for Critical Service Providers. And that's available on our website. But I just wanted to walk through some of the really top level highlights of it, because I feel like it was a good encapsulation of just what we were seeing as really just what was impeding folks from successfully installing solar and storage in their facilities. So this may be surprising to you all, I don't know. It was a little surprising to us, maybe just because of our sample size, but the number one barrier that folks were encountering was just lack of information about battery storage. And this can kind of, cut across like a few different sort of categories of lack of information. I mean, for a lot of folks, it's both they themselves maybe don't know all about the benefits of battery storage and what it can mean for their facility and the benefits it can provide. But it's also a lack of information among, financiers and vendors and contractors. And, all those information gaps can really just impede the process and really slow things down, even once you're in the process of development of a project. And then the second one that was almost even with lack of information of battery storage was technical issues, which is a very, very broad term, and it can encompass a lot. I mean, the range of issues that can arise when incorporating solar and storage into a project can be, everything from sort of the specs, so, a limited amount of viable roof space for solar panels, to not being able to isolate critical loads, so you can't back them up for resilient power. And all of those issues can be very time consuming and expensive to fix, particularly if you're already, in the process of renovating a property or building a new property. So that can just be a huge impediment to the success of a solar and storage installation on a property. A lot of the times what we would see with the projects that we've helped implement is that those kind of technical issues can just snowball and keep adding costs to pursuing solar and storage. And folks are like, you know what, we just can't do it for this project, maybe another time. But that can be a huge issue, particularly also with siting, if a facility has already kind of been fully baked, and then you run into issues where it's like, oh, well, we can't site the batteries in this electrical closet, or, the HVAC systems can't be moved. So then we have even more limited roof space for solar. Those sorts of issues, once the project's facility has already been built, there's only so much you want to do or can financially are feasible to do. Permitting and interconnection issues, I did also want to touch on, because, the process of connecting solar and battery storage to the grid can be very complicated, particularly, again, for larger projects. So we're seeing this a lot with affordable housing projects, just because they're larger. A lot of utilities, if it's a larger site, may require a interconnection review if you wanted to get it connected, solar and storage connected. And that can just really slow the process down. And it really does depend on your utility and if they're used to solar and storage or not. I mean, we've seen pretty good results with folks like National Grid. They get a lot of solar and storage projects, but it just really depends on how much experience they have with those sorts of projects, and just how large your project is to begin with. The lack of financing options, I'll dig a little bit more deeper into a little later on, but a lot of the issues there are just the lack of options to finance the upfront costs of getting a system. Particularly, again, we work mostly in low-income communities, so a lot of those community service providers don't have the funds upfront necessarily to want to either pay for a system wholesale, or they have difficulty finding financing because, again, not all lenders know about battery storage in particular and might not be willing to take on the risk of lending for a battery storage system to begin with. So there's just not as much flexibility in terms of interest rates and things like that. And that can all just really impede the process. Similarly, the project not being economically feasible kind of gets into all of those things. It could be everything from sort of the utility rate tariffs, or unfavorable net metering policies, or just a lack of incentive and revenue opportunities. Massachusetts has a fairly favorable environment for that, but again, it does really depend on just sort of where you are, who your utility is, the particular site itself, and just what your utility rate tariff is. And that's why we really try to help with the pre-development feasibility analyses, because you can look at all that information ahead of time instead of getting, halfway through the development process and realizing, oh, you know what, this is probably not going to work out financially for us, unfortunately. And that again ties into kind of just the issue of regulatory uncertainty and just lack of information and communication from the utilities or public service or public utility commissions. For a lot of folks, again, not as much of an issue in Massachusetts, but can be hard to plan ahead for long-term projects when there is that regulatory uncertainty. And then I did want to flag these last three. As you can see, there wasn't a strong response from our survey respondents on this, but part of the reason we wanted to include these last three barriers on the survey is because this was something anecdotally we were seeing could be an issue that's cropping up in projects that we were helping with, so difficulties with battery storage vendors. This is particularly relevant for kind of more niche applications. Even though battery storage is definitely becoming much more common, it is still a fairly small market. And for example, not all solar installers offer battery storage or are familiar with it. So it depends on who you're working with. And also not all battery vendors are necessarily work with affordable housing providers. A lot of affordable housing developments you all might know this, it can offer a very different usage profile than most vendors are used to. It's often a mix of kind of the residential and the commercial. And so it's often difficult to find a system that works for that particular mix. And it really, again, depends on the individual facility for that. So that has been an issue that we've seen come across in projects, even though it's not as many folks really expected to encounter it in this survey. And then the fire safety concerns are kind of two-pronged. Fire safety concerns, again, can be especially problematic for example, affordable housing developers, just because there's often a lot of regulations around the types of power generation that can be used to provide backup emergency power. So we have had issues where folks, even if they had battery storage, they also had to get a generator because the fire codes just didn't allow for, the emergency track lighting or elevator banks to be powered by battery storage. And that's unfortunately just requires an update on the fire code requirements. And just, again, kind of depends on who you're working with and who you encounter. We've also seen there is still kind of a stigma around concerns on fire safety of batteries. Unfortunately, if very, very rarely, even if a battery is installed improperly or is somehow malfunctions, you do get those cases of thermal runaway and fires. They're super rare instances, but the image of that, the threat of that is still a concern that some people have. And we've seen, safety inspectors just shut down a conversation on approval because they're like, oh, well, these are hugely dangerous and, just can cause huge fire hazards. And, that's just a matter of education. It gets back to that lack of information. We actually, CEG works with a great fire chief, retired fire chief now, Captain Richard Burt, who he is a former fire chief who is now a solar and storage evangelist because he has seen how helpful they can be to fire emergency service providers in a outage situation. Particularly, he was actually in Puerto Rico right after Maria, where solar and storage just provides that life-saving battery backup, where folks don't have to run out and get diesel for their generator to back up life-saving equipment or communications equipment. So he actually does go around to fire departments around the country to talk about how to safely fight battery fires and just also how safe they can be to hopefully just kind of cut down on those sorts of issues where folks are shutting down those conversations. And then finally, the last piece, just lack of access to building energy usage data. Again, really depends on your facility and just what information you have access to, but this is also, again, goes to, just who your utility is and how much information there you have available. Not all utilities provide kind of that detailed hourly information that is most useful when you're trying to size for a battery system. You don't want to oversize based on your needs and end up paying for more than you have to. But if you don't have that kind of hourly usage data, that does become a bit more complicated. And that also is complicated again by COVID, because for a lot of folks, their buildings just haven't been being used like they regularly would be. So that last year of data is kind of useless. And if you don't have that historical data to back it up, it can just make things a little bit more difficult. There's definitely ways to estimate it. But again, that goes into kind of having the access to sort of pre-development feasibility analyses where you can make sure you have all the information available ahead of time to understand just what size of system you would be looking for. So that was a lot of talk about barriers. I did want to touch on sort of, again, going deeper into the economic factors and funding considerations. This graph can be a little confusing because essentially folks were allowed to choose as many economic factors and funding considerations they were looking at for their solar and storage projects. So the 60% all chose solar credits and net metering, but then also they all chose private foundation grants and so on and so forth. So just the one thing I wanted to flag there is that, obviously the solar credits, that's mostly discussing ways to finance solar energy specifically and not so much the storage, but the private foundation grants again gets into, there are some foundations that provide sort of like we do the technical assistance grants to defray the cost of things like feasibility analyses or also installation and also operation and maintenance costs, which can be a huge issue for a lot of smaller organizations. Or, some foundations do also just provide grants to cover the cost of installing solar and storage. And that can make a huge difference in the economics over time for, like the 20 or 30-year lifetime of a system when you're looking at reducing the cost of the upfront installation. And then one thing I also want to just flag quickly, because I think it's a cool program, there are some states that offer grants as well. There are folks like NYSERDA offer funding to address sort of resource gaps and market barriers for solar and storage in low-income communities in particular. And that's hopefully something that we'll see replicated in a few other states. And then we have things like, again, providing utility services, so demand response, or things like connected solutions where it's similar to demand response, but just shaving peak demand at certain times of day, things like that. Providing grid services are one of the most common ways that folks look at financing a system. So talked a lot about barriers, talked a lot about kind of the financing considerations. And now I just want to get into sort of the overall recommendations we developed partially as a basis of the report and also just kind of things we've seen generally. So as I said, the lack of information about battery storage and awareness was the #1 barrier identified by the survey respondents. And a lot of that just gets down to, webinars like this are great, kind of just freely available educational materials like case studies. We offer sample building analyses, things like that, so folks know what they're getting into if they decide to pursue like a feasibility analysis for solar and storage. And also, things like more freely available industry materials. So we are actually working with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory on a tool called Reopt Lite, which some of you may have heard of, which allows folks to, while maybe not, a very in-depth analysis of the solar and storage feasibility for a site, it does allow them to like upload utility data and, the geographic coordinates of a site, and gives you a sense of how the financial costs of a system and how many energy savings, for example, you'd be saving over time. And tools like that, which can just help folks kind of play around in the space and get a little bit more used to it. And that kind of leads into our second recommendation, which is just opportunities for capacity building. Most of the folks we work with are not experts in solar and storage. They're either affordable housing developers, or they're, a community service organization, or they're fire department. So they're already at capacity doing really important work. And most of those folks, don't have the time or the capacity to really get into the very complex technical issues that can crop up when you're looking at installing solar and storage. So for a lot of those reasons, we think programs that can offer some internal capacity building, either funds for that or just sort of knowledge building opportunities can be really valuable. We do offer a capacity building grants to the Resilient Power Leadership Initiative, where we mostly provide capacity building grants to nonprofit organizations in environmental justice or low income communities, primarily BIPOC communities as well. And that's, usually we combine the Ripley Awards with the Technical Assistance Fund so that as they're going through the process, that organization has someone who can spend the time learning, like, okay, what does this actually all mean? And then can in turn, they can go into their communities and expand that knowledge and spread it to other community organizations. And there are other organizations that offer similar grants. I know, for example, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network offers something called the Innovation Fund, which provides training tools. That's primarily for local governments and municipalities to kind of grow their capacity for understanding solar and storage and pursuing sort of those sorts of projects in municipal properties. And then I probably won't harp on the technical assistance support anymore because I've talked to all of you about how great we think it is. And, not just because we provide it, there are other organizations that provide technical assistance funds. The South-Based Institute has a very similar program called the Good Use Program that offers, actually they offer technical assistance funds for both pre-development feasibility analyses, but then also for installation costs and operation and maintenance costs as well. So it's a little more comprehensive. But it is just makes such a huge difference for an organization if they just have sort of that educated or, kind of independent third party who can walk them through the process a bit. When, certain technical issues do crop up, they can turn to that person and be like, okay, can you explain this a little bit to me? It can really make or break a project, particularly for those smaller organizations that are, already at capacity. And then on developing innovative incentive and finance options, I did want to talk about connected solutions a little bit more, just because, again, we think it's a really cool program. My colleague at CEG, Todd Alinsky-Paul, actually helped get it started in Massachusetts. So we're huge fans of connected solutions. Connected Solutions is essentially a utility-run battery storage program that's, it's actually currently available throughout the several states in the Northeast, I think Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. And that, again, gives customers kind of an opportunity to monetize grid services provided by their batteries. And one thing that is, as opposed to a demand response program, where if you sign up for it and then when you're asked to discharge during a peak use time, you are unable to for whatever reason, you're penalized for that. With Connected Solutions, you're not penalized, you just don't receive the incentive for that particular demand event, which is really nice because it gives battery storage owners a bit more flexibility in when they choose to discharge or not. And they can still have the flexibility, but take advantage of the incentive program. So it has really improved kind of battery storage outcomes for a lot of projects in Massachusetts is what we've seen. And that report that I flagged for y'all earlier is goes into kind of the economics of all of that and much more deeply than I can because I'm not an expert. And then finally, one thing I just wanted to flag was establishing a monetary value for resilience. This is a pretty complicated issue that doesn't have a ton of, it can just be a little thorny just because for a lot of folks, it's very difficult to establish a monetary value for resilience. There aren't like established formulas out there. But what we've seen is, for those community facilities that are, really value the ability to provide backup power for their community, it can look like, either for a business, kind of like hours of productivity that you're not going to lose because of an outage. It could look like improved health outcomes if you're able to provide, refrigeration services for medications or backup life-saving equipment. Like I said before, a lot of those fire departments, a big thing for them was having access to communications equipment so that they could hear actual emergency calls. That can be really valuable. And so we have seen, if you do the analysis, creating a monetary value for resilience just vastly improves the financial outcomes of a lot of projects. But it's obviously not always feasible for everyone to do that. If it's just not a priority, that makes sense. But it can really improve the outcomes for resilient power projects in particular, where you're not just looking at, okay, what's the size of the system we need to be providing bill savings, but what do we need to power ourselves through an outage and provide that additional resilient power benefit. So I've talked for a long time, but I hope that all of you have learned a little bit. And, like I said, there's a ton of resources on our website, and happy to answer some questions. And yeah, I will turn my fan back on and go on mute now.
Thank you. That was fantastic. We'll get to questions here at the end. I want to turn things over first to our last featured speaker, Isaac. Are you here and ready to go, Isaac?
I sure am.
Fantastic. Take it away.
All right. Well, nice to be here with you all, and I will quickly dive in, but hopefully just can shed some light on our experience developing some of these arrays and hitting targets around Passive House and other environmental certifications. Let me just quickly get us to full screen. All right. My name is Isaac Baker. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEOs at Resonant Energy, which is a social enterprise or a solar development company based in Dorchester, focused on expanding access to clean energy. Our primary clients are nonprofits, affordable housing, mission-related projects that we're doing all across Massachusetts and New York as our scope as a developer. And our expertise is in rolling up our sleeves and diving into complexity, which, as it turns out, is what affordable housing and solar and passive house all introduces to trying to thread the needle on all of these pieces. To give you some examples, and again, our experience with passive house is largely in the affordable multifamily context, recognizing that that can be a broader setup, or can apply to other buildings, of course. But I will be primarily speaking to our experience in the affordable housing community around that. So when we get started looking at projects, we'll look at all the different certifications a building might be going for, PHIUS being far and away the most common thing we're seeing for new affordable housing projects right now. But we're also seeing the city of Boston has an energy positive requirement for many new projects that we're helping clients hit. LEED, Silver, Gold, or Platinum, Energy Star, Enterprise Green Communities, et cetera. So we will want to get our arms around that and figure out what we're designing for. And then we work closely with architects, electrical subs, and energy consultants like New Ecology on how to make our PV designs meet the targets that come with all of this. And, just some example clients at the bottom, but we're working with a whole host of CDCs, the community builders, Urban Edge, Dakota partners, lots of different clients across the state on new construction projects that are meeting one or more of these design items noted above. This is a very complicated slide, so I'm not going to assume that anyone will read all of this, but the goal here is just to outline that there are different ways to finance a solar project. And so the most common here is direct ownership, which is probably the thing folks are most familiar with, which would be just buying the panels outright. And depending on what certification you're going for and what economic considerations you have for the project, that may be the right one for you. And as I've noted here, PHIUS or Passive House may require that you own the system in order to qualify. And so that's one of the big considerations for why clients are often choosing this option when they're trying to go for Passive House in our experience. And what I'll note is, just to quickly summarize some of these other options, we do have expertise in helping people think about alternate financing options. So for a power purchase agreement, that's a zero upfront cost option to integrating solar that we're doing for many new construction buildings. Again, because Passive House often requires direct ownership, we don't see this option as often there. But affordable housing partners are often using this to retrofit solar onto an existing building that maybe didn't do Passive House. Or they're using it for a building that's not doing Passive House, but is doing energy positive. And I'll talk a little bit more about, kind of the different considerations about renewable energy credits. But separating out the passive house requirements, you can, pay for it outright. You can get a no cost option with the power purchase agreement, which is a pay as you go solar financing solution, where you can usually get about a 10 to a 30% discount on the building's electricity, typically tied into the common area meter if you're doing multifamily, or some central meter for the building. There's a site lease. We're doing this for one client that's going for an E+ or energy positive program, where they weren't required to even use the building on site. They just needed to do some production. And so we're actually just renting their roof, maxing out the production, and selling the power locally as community solar, which is another version of a no cost option. The main difference between 2 and 3 here is that power purchase agreement, you use the power on site with the pay as you go financing. Site lease, you might receive a cash lease payment or free electricity for maybe 10, 15% of the output in lieu of lease payment as a form of lease payment. But both of these are no cost options. Finally, there's a prepaid power purchase agreement option. I won't go into this in detail, but this can be is good for nonprofit owned buildings that can't take advantage of the tax credit. So it's a way of having ownership like economics, but by selling off the solar tax credit. And I won't talk about all this in detail, but in case this is helpful for people who are wading into solar for the first time, solar comes with a 26% federal tax credit right now, which is one of the biggest drivers of the economics for solar. And so which financing option you go with is largely driven by, can you take advantage of that tax credit? If you spend $100,000 on solar, someone's going to get, who owns that system, a $26,000 tax credit at the end of the day. And are you, as the person who wants solar on your roof, are you able to take advantage of that? Or is your investment partner on the building able to do that? Or how are you going to make use of it? And if the answer is, I don't know, and we don't have a good person to take advantage of it, usually options other than direct ownership are good to consider, because these no cost options imply that we're basically letting a third party monetize that tax credit, which is usually helpful for making the economics of solar work. The next pieces I just want to talk about are kind of infrastructure related, but just to help people think creatively about how to get solar into a building. So these are the most common designs. Ballast mounted is where the racking rests on a flat roof. There are ballast blocks that weigh the panels down, and those help to keep the panels on the roof. This is great because you don't have to make any penetrations through the roof membrane, whether that be TPO or EPDM. And it weighs about 6 to 9 pounds per square feet on average. So you got to make sure with a building that it structurally has the capacity to carry that. In some cases, we have ballasted with glue attachments where we can actually glue the rack to the membrane below. And as you can see, it comes with some extra cost, but it lowers the weight of the system down to 3 to 5 pounds per square foot. So that can be one way to still get a ballasted solution to not do, and especially if you're doing a passive house building, if you're doing a flat roof, you'll often see 5 to 8 inches of rigid foam that comes below the roof membrane. And so finding a bolt to bolt your solar installation through 5 inches of rigid foam down to the decking to actually attach it can be really complicated. And so that's why having these solutions that don't require making a penetration to actually hold the PV on the roof is usually going to be the best option for a flat roof. For sloped roofs, it would be, if you've seen solar on a residential home, the kind of often you'll see a typical, for a sloped roof, just rails that get mounted into the roof structure. And with those penetrations and attachments, we lower the weight considerably down to 2 to 3 pounds per square foot. And so this is the easy go-to solution for sloped roofs, and mechanical attachments for flat roofs are doable, but again, very complicated, especially in passive house implementations where you have really deep insulation that you need to consider. Another type of racking that we're using a lot is called the wavelet racking setup. This allows you, as you can see, this gets you to a pretty dense panel setup where, as you can see, the inter-row spacing between each panel set is really light. So your output per panel goes down somewhat in this setup, but and the overall weight of the system is heavier, but you get so many more panels into such a dense roof square footage that, especially if we're trying to meet really aggressive passive house goals with not very much roof space, this is a very common racking setup that we'll go for. And this is not all that much more expensive than ballasted, and this can still be a ballast mounted solution. The trade-off is it's a little heavier, so you might have to go up to 12 pounds per square foot in your carrying capacity for structural on the design. Lastly, I will introduce the post and rail racking solution. So one of the big barriers to some of these prior racking solutions is, as you can see, these are right on the roof. So if you have a piece of HVAC or a gas line or a roof vent or other pieces, every one of those is going to delete panels and make it hard to get these up on the roof. So if you have a really busy roof, as you can see, gas lines and vents all running beneath it, you can go with this raised post and rail style racking solution. Very common in New York City, where you have really dense roofs and not a lot of space. We see it less in Massachusetts, but we're starting to see it more and more. We're doing a new project with Nuestra CDC in Roxbury that's going to feature this type of racking right now. And the cost, it will add an extra 20 to 25% to the overall PV cost. So between labor and the complexity, and then this is also going to require attachments. So each piece of the racking needs to penetrate the membrane and actually attach in order to hold this down. And so that significantly adds to the installation complexity and requires some extra coordination on the design front to be able to integrate this, but can allow you to get a lot more panels up there as a trade-off. And there is a final racking solution that is just another raised rack that we're starting to see, where you can see at the low edge, we're really only about a foot off the ground here. We have another rack, that racking solution that was very popular in DC, where the incentives were incredibly high and on small roof spaces, where actually the whole racking solution goes up about 5 feet and can actually get up above HVAC units entirely. So that might be, you could think of it as like a little roof for your roof that is filled with solar. And that can allow you to get up above, like a lot of folks are going with air source heat pumps. So you might have like a bank of air source heat pump handlers all across the roof that are all maybe 4 feet tall. This type of racking solution could help you raise above all of that. And again, would come with roughly a 25% cost increase relative to a ballasted solution. So these are all just to get your brain going on the idea that there's many ways to get panels on the roof. Some are more cost effective than others. And those are all pieces that we consider in the design stage for basically what's the most cost effective solution that can help you hit your output targets or goals for this building. I want to give you a couple examples. So this first one is we're doing with Dakota Partners right now, just to give you an example for Passive House of what this looks like. So they're going for the PHIUS Core Plus, I believe 2018, not the 2021 version. Since this project got started, I think 2019 or 2020. The output target that came out of their PHIUS model with their consultant was they needed 65,000 kilowatt hours of generation. We took this set of requirements with their building drawings and we came up with a 77 kilowatt design that well exceeded the 65,000 kilowatt hour target because they happened to have a lot of space. And they were doing we did a sloped roof attachment racking solution on a kind of standard sloped roof asphalt shingle. And as a reminder that was 3 pounds per square foot. And this is an example of what that looks like here. So that is, as you can see, this is a sort of so this is a south facing roof. And I believe this is then an east facing roof that we decided to put panels on. And as you can see, they actually had some more space. We could have put some panels. So sometimes the math works out that way where you you design a really efficient building such that you've got more roof space than you need to hit the target. Another example here, this is with Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation. They had a target for a 45,000 kilowatt hours, and we were able to design a 55 kilowatt DC solution, producing 60,000 kilowatt hours. And this would be a flat ballasted racking solution at around 8 pounds per square foot. And you can see the design here where we are, we're doing a standard ballast mounted racking solution. You got some spaces in between the rows. Each panel is tilted up at about a 10-degree tilt, facing east or west or south. And as you can see, we had to really kind of cram these in around the edges to hit that target, but we were able to do that by tightening up our row spacing and things like that to get that all on the roof. Two other pieces, I'm realizing that my my updates that I made to this did not, looks like did not fully download, because I wanted to share one piece to address Julie's question. So sorry, just give me one moment. So one piece I wanted to circle back on was this meeting requirements issue, which was with on-site and off-site solar solutions, how do we actually get buildings to be able to qualify? And there's some complexity in Massachusetts in particular on this front that I wanted to cover. So in Massachusetts, we have what's called the SMART program. And I talked earlier about how when you choose how you finance your solar array, the tax credit's one of the big drivers of which solution you might go for. The SMART program is another big roadblock to how, or potential impediment to how solar and passive house integrate. And the key piece is the RECs, or the renewable energy credits. In the Massachusetts program, depending on your system size, your solar array is going to qualify for a 10 or a 20-year incentive period. And in the fine print of that paperwork, you are required to assign the RECs, which is the renewable attribute that your solar array is producing. You are basically forced to sell or assign those to the utility during the period that they're paying you for the incentives. And the challenge is that they've put, the state program has made a bunch of really lucrative incentives, for instance, for affordable housing or rooftop siting or parking canopy siting. There's all these things where they said, we want to create these carrots to incentivize people to do solar for affordable housing, solar on rooftops, solar on canopies. And they tied these lucrative incentives to the SMART incentive. And so what that means is often, you're producing a renewable energy attribute, and the utility is saying through this SMART program, I'm going to pay you up to like 10 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour for 20 years, which is a really lucrative incentive. And so it's crazy to not take them up on that when you're installing solar. And then the trade-off is that you're putting up solar, and even if you own it, you don't technically own the attribute to the renewable credit that you're creating when you put solar up. And so previous iterations of Passive House have not really been, it's a nationwide program, and they have not really been hip to all of this REC stuff. So they've just basically said, if you own it, we're just going to assume that you own the renewable energy attribute. Whereas in Massachusetts, whether you own it or not, you're almost always not having the RECs, because you're selling them as part of participating in the SMART program. And so the trade-off, as PHIUS gets more hip to this, as it looks like they're going to in the 2021 update, is how we navigate this. In certain parts of the state, like in National Grid, and which is most of the central part of the state, and Eversource West, it's going to become increasingly viable to simply forego the SMART incentives altogether, because they are declining right now, and to just keep the RECs. Whereas in Eversource East, the incentives, which is the kind of greater Boston area and the Cape, the incentives are so high right now that it really doesn't make sense to do. So it kind of makes sense to install solar for its economics by itself, and then to purchase offsite attributes, which makes no intuitive sense, but is how this whole incentive regime has gotten laid out. So then the question is, if I'm buying offsite renewable energy credits, what does that look like? And right now, the Massachusetts Class 1 RECs are going for a forward contract of 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. This is just an example calculation using some of the table that Tom Chase shared at the top of the hour, which is to say, let's just say, for example, a building's required to get 100,000 kilowatt hours for on-site capacity. So basically you can build a 90 kilowatt DC array on site that would produce 100,000 kilowatt hours. And you might have to forego the SMART program to retain your renewable energy credits. So that's option one, is to build a solar system and to not sell the attributes by participating in the SMART program. Option two would be to buy offsite, which at a 5-to-1 ratio, because they would weight offsite more poorly, you'd have to buy 500,000 kilowatt hours a year, which at 4 cents a kilowatt hour would be $20,000 a year, which is a really substantial pinch on an operating budget because there's no like savings that come with this. This is just an absolute additional cost of complying that you would have to add to the operating budget for the building. Now this, I should just keep in mind, this is to buy what we think of as good RECs, which are Class 1 Massachusetts RECs. It is possible to buy what we think of as kind of garbage RECs, quote unquote, which would be like getting renewable energy credits from a wind farm in the Midwest where they don't really have a viable renewable energy market. And so you're not really contributing to additionality where your purchasing power there is not really helping to produce new wind so much as existing wind farms are just getting a little bit of extra money by selling you their RECs. So if places care about driving new additional clean energy into the world, buying a REC from a place where there's an established market of buyers and sellers, like we have in Massachusetts and in the Northeast, is key to that. And many cities and towns and other places, I think, are going to increasingly push towards retaining Massachusetts Class 1 RECs. So that's why I raised that. Now, Passive House as a nationwide program is likely not going to require Class 1 RECs. So maybe the cheapest cost of compliance would be trying to figure out how to sign up for buying very, very cheap RECs from out of state wind farms or large commercial solar farms in Texas, where we see a huge amount of new clean energy generation coming online. And those you could buy as low as like 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So 25% of what you would buy a Class 1 REC for in state. So that's just a little bit of background. And what I'll close with are just solar ready best practices of things to think about as you are planning for solar for your building. The number one item is to engage a solar vendor early. I've had a number of circumstances where people wanted to do Passive House and they built the whole building and invited us to come look into solar at the end of the process. And they had planned for all of this equipment and HVAC and vents. And so there's almost nowhere to put solar. And then we weren't actually able to fit enough solar to meet their Passive House requirement. And certainly weren't without going to like a big raised canopy solution over all their HVAC that was going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars that they didn't have appetite for at the end of the construction cycle. So getting the solar plan together early is really key because it is a major part of the Passive House compliance process. The next recommendation is to have architects and general contractors defend roof space. Common issues are gas lines and roof vents that can eliminate space for panels. And if you have too many obstructions, it makes it impossible to do a ballast mounted solution because we need continuous roof area. And if it's really carved up by a lot of issues, then we actually won't be able to do a ballasted solution at all. Because the number of blocks that would be required would be too high. So again, defending kind of open continuous roof area is one of the key pieces for solar. For structural, again, for flat roofs, 10 pounds per square foot is key to plan for. And for sloped roofs, it's 2 to 3 pounds per square foot of additional weight. conduit, run a 4-inch conduit from the roof directly to the electric room. And then output and load matching. This is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but we have all these new requirements that are requiring people to put up solar, and people come to us and they say, well, just put up the solar. And then our question is, where are we going to plug it into, right? Like when you're producing thousands of kilowatt hours worth of energy, it needs to offset something. And especially in a multifamily context, that mostly means the common area meter. And so, but often a lot of buildings are designed with really nominal common area usage, where most of the usage is being tied to tenant meters, which are really complex and inconvenient for us to try and offset, because we can't, by Massachusetts laws and in most states, you can't install like 6 panels on the roof and tie it in them each into each of the individual tenant meters, because it's really, really cost prohibitive and ineffective by the kind of policy around net metering and other pieces for how solar works. So you usually need to build one solar array and tie it in one place, which is a common meter. And that means you need to electrify and centralize as much as you can, especially when that comes to space heating and cooling, water heating, or other things that could be fossil fuel based. If you can electrify and centralize, that makes solar much more viable. And what Julie presented on in her example earlier with a central VRF system that provides heating and cooling, that's the kind of gold standard that we look for, where that's gonna, when we see that, we know it's gonna be really easy to incorporate solar into that building, because you've centralized and electrified both your heating and cooling for the building. With that, I will close.
Thank you so much. That was great. These were all excellent presentations. We're going to open it up now to questions tonight for our guests, for Isaac, for Abby, for Julie, for Tom. You can use the raise hand feature, so you can I can see you and we can let you speak directly and ask your question. You can use the chat room if you want to do that, and I can try to read them out. But please ask away. Until I kind of see one come up here, I don't have so much a question as a comment. Isaac, I really like that solar ready part at the end, and really hitting at that this takes planning and thinking of solar in the design phase is really critical. And we've been talking a lot in our previous sessions about the necessity to do passive house first in order to get to net zero. And even if you can't get to net zero right away with the project, getting to passive house is important. You can add solar later. But this reminds us of that key to that, yeah, you can add solar later, but if you don't design to be solar ready, you actually might not be able to do it how you thought you would. Even if you can't hit net zero right away with renewables, designing properly so that you have the space to do it can help. We have questions here for folks. Jump on in.
I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So I'm interested in, it seems like conceptually we're talking about 2 things. One is net zero. We know that everybody's moving toward hopefully net zero codes. And we probably are close to understanding what the definition of net zero is. I'm not convinced we are, but then there's the question of resiliency beyond net zero. And this is, I think, where the battery storage really comes in. And I'm curious about how do we define resiliency? I mean, do we say that we want a building where people do not have to, they can live in place for a week during a winter storm when the power is out? How do we define the metric of what's resilient? Because that you spoke about the idea of monetary value of resilience. And it seems to me that in order to monetize it, you have to start defining what is it? How big a battery means how long can people still function in the building, et cetera?
I think that's a great question, Hank, that I can only answer because doing the feasibility study at Bartlett was, initially if we said we create an area of refuge in our community space, offices, so there's those loads, then, the building department, or because of the size of the building, we have to have at least one elevator running. fire pump, you know, there may be some other emergency loads. We figure out those loads, what that area of refuge requires. And then we say, okay, here's the load, what's the battery? But the thing is the elevator is not going to be doing a continuous, you know, up and down. There may be some other loads that are sort of sporadic. So one key thing that I don't know if anybody mentioned is getting interval data. So like a 15-minute interval data piece so that you can really analyze your curve, your demand curve. It plays into this a lot. And then on the resiliency side, you know, it's really looking at each one of those loads to try to say, all right, the elevator is going to run twice an hour. You know, these plugs, you know, there's this many plugs that people are going to be charging cell phones. So it's doable, I think, that calculation, but it's not as simple. So you can size that's how you can size your battery. And, you know, on the response we got from the building department, which we were kind of in shock about because the design we have is almost like it's a container that has its own fire suppression, its own controls, its own, you know, wireless connection in terms of control. So a lot of the concerns they had, if they knew more about the design we had, you know, projected or proposed, they probably would have been a little bit more receptive. But I think it's just, you know, what we've talked about is that we're going to get a group of experts together and go talk to the city. And I think if we can get it figured out for one project, then Boston will have an easier time. Maybe Massachusetts will have an easier time of using these. Because I think there's a lot of, just like Passive House, there's a lot of demystification that we have to do.
Yeah, and I'll also add, it's often kind of establishing the value of resilience is very site specific. So as Julie said, it really does depend on what your goals are for having a system. So if it's just, you know, peak shaving, you want to just reduce your electric bill costs, you're likely going to have a smaller system than if you're like, well, we want to be able to provide backup power for 2 to 3 days for our community. So yeah, like in Julie's case, you know, they wanted to have a sort of central gathering place in case of an outage. So what that looks like versus if they were just planning on using the battery as sort of on a daily basis to reduce peaks is kind of very different. So that's as part of the reason there's honestly not like one go-to formula for how to establish a monetary value resilience, because it depends on the site. You know, if you're, you know, a business and you want to consider sort of the lost value of productivity, if you have an outage, that's going to look very different than if you're, you know, a homeless shelter, for example. So yeah, it's definitely kind of tricky, and it very much depends on the goals you have for the site.
Yeah, I think I would add to this that we, Passive House, kind of look to the advantages of Passive House to be able to coast in a resilient way. And it feels like that's, you know, that's a major advantage to marrying Passive House with these type of resiliency concepts. And so it's very interesting to me, once we say we're looking to make a building be able to coast, and the advantage of this is that we don't have people moving out, then I think, as Julie's pointing out, you have to start looking at all your systems to say, well, have we set it up so that that pipe isn't going to freeze? Have we set it up so that the elevators are going to work? Have we set it up so that there's a common area space, or there's common outlets for people to charge cell phones? All those decisions, I think, have to come into it to size a resilient system.
Yeah, because Hank, I'll tell you, the conversation we had with our engineers, like they had the emergency lights, which we all know can go on their own backup ballast. They had the garage ventilation fans. They had makeup air. Well, we have ventless dryer, so I don't know if that air was really in there. And when we pressed them on it, they said, well, of course you could do backup batteries on your lights individually. And then they only want the garage ventilation if you have a generator. They only want you to put that on there. So there were a lot of loads that I had assumed were emergency backup loads required because the engineer had sized the generator for that. When if you're going to do a generator, you might as well put those on there. Well, it's like, well, let's really be focused in on what those loads should be. as opposed to, well, if we have a fossil fuel generator, we might as well put that stuff on there.
Yeah.
I'd also add quickly just on the duration, Hank, that you raised, because obviously, resiliency is, as Abby noted, it's different based on every application of like what the lost value is. And then the time period that I often encourage our clients to think about is, a week seems like a number that people often latch onto of like, that's resiliency is a week, right? Which is an arbitrary number that is also, and the real question is like, if you look at the historical data in the Eversource Greater Boston area, what's a typical outage period? And the answer is not a week, right? The answer is like 48 hours maybe, or something like that. So the question is like, are we going to build 3 times as much storage to plan for a 100-year event? Or are we going to build a third of that to plan for the common event that will happen a dozen times in the life of the building? And those are the different considerations. Or I would say, like, to me, 2 to 3 days is like probably going to cover the vast majority of the issues that you're facing. And by the time power is out for a week, you're not going to want to stay in a place that the power is out for a week, because you can't go anywhere else, right? And then there's like, you can't go to the grocery store, and you can't, like there's a lot of other issues that can arrive for those really significant outages. So that's something I think to consider in this overall piece. And I just want to echo what Julie was saying, that identifying, like, one of the big trade-offs that I have is from resiliency is like, especially for heating and cooling, like you want to keep cooling going if we have an outage for like the hottest day of the year, because people can, especially in elderly applications, it's a real health risk. And then the trade-off is if you electrify cooling, you can't run that for a second on a battery because it uses so much power to run cooling during that scenario. So it actually works better if you have gas powered heating and cooling, and then you have enough electric backup to kind of keep that running in an outage scenario, because it only uses a tiny amount of electricity to run fans and other stuff. So there's all kinds of interesting problems around climate change and electrification and resiliency that come up when you're doing that planning.
Yeah, I think that there's some reasons to think about the idea that, maybe there's a place for fossil fuel backup generators. If that's the only fossil fuel, if we have an all electric building, and in order to achieve some of our resiliency goals, like heating and or cooling, that we need that type of fossil fuel backup, I think it's something that we should be considering as we think about all electric buildings.
May I just ask along that line, is it reasonable to assume that a fossil fuel generator might be considered as a temporary add-in in those moments of need, but as Isaac was saying, perhaps scaling a more likely event scenario for a battery backup situation, and just bringing in the fossil fuel as needed, perhaps planned for, perhaps you've got your generator and your space and your connection all ready to go, just not that it resides there permanently.
The big challenge that I'll say on that is, like, to truly plan for resiliency, let's say you have an all electric building and then you throw in a generator, which by code is still required at minimum to kind of cover your elevators and a few other life safety items that you can't substitute storage for right now under the code. To actually store enough diesel fuel on site to run that electric cooling for any period of time is really not feasible. So the only version where you could actually run heating and cooling that I've seen for a building for a week during an outage would be a building that is tied to natural gas pipeline infrastructure, right? And then you have enough electricity to keep that all going. And then because you're not trying to store enough fossil fuels on site, you're tapped into a pipeline that has an unlimited amount of gas that can keep running that. But to actually store that amount of fuel on site in diesel form would require a way larger container than anyone ever builds for a building. So that is, to me, the main one of the main challenges of electrified heating and cooling is that you can probably do a little bit, but you would have to cycle it really substantially during a outage scenario.
I think that's why we count on the robust enclosure to sort of hang us in there for probably less in cooling than in heating, but to the extent we can maintain those temperatures because of our insulation, adds to the value of passive.
Agreed. Very big part of the envelope.
Now's the time for other questions out there if folks have them.
I always have more. So it's interesting to me. We're again, I put this all in the context of net zero. I'm moving away from resiliency now and just saying we're talking about net zero buildings. And Isaac, you were pointing to the idea that you need as much as you can get in the way of common loads, ideally. And yet we have this tension where most multifamily housing is set up with individual meters. And therefore, as you point out, the common loads tend not to be very large. But presumably with net zero, we're saying if the building has to be net zero and has to build or buy the renewable power it needs, that's for the entire building, including the residents' meters, the estimated power that the residents are going to use, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you've hit the nail on the head, which is that, we've got the engineers will say, all right, this building's going to use 300,000 kilowatt hours, right? Or 400,000 kilowatt hours. It's super efficient. It's all electric, but it's still going to use a good amount of power. But only 50,000 is going to be on the common. That's maybe a laundry, that's 2 elevators, hall lights, stuff like that. Then everything else is going to be on the individual tenant meters because, or, depending if it's owner occupied or not, but the individual residential meters. If we are doing an energy positive requirement or net zero, we have to cover all 400,000, but we don't have any kind of economic way really to distribute the value across all of those meters. It can be done at some financial trade-off where we install solar on a standalone meter and then we use a crediting mechanism to sprinkle the value across all the individual meters. But it's incredibly cumbersome and you lose a bunch of financial value compared to if you had centralized that heating and cooling on a central VRF system and had moved most of that electric onto a common single meter that you could tie solar in behind. So the short answer is it absolutely can be done, but it's challenging. And one developer we worked with said, I don't even want to deal with trying to figure out how to credit all of this to my meters participating in the City of Boston Energy Plus program. And so we came up with a mechanism where we rented their roof and we're going to sell the power offsite for community solar. And we're going to, distribute it to other local businesses because that was way easier than trying to integrate in and sell all the power to the individual tenants. And can they opt in? And what happens when they move out and a new tenant moves in and all kinds of billing and, deal structure complexity that we just avoided by this full offsite project setup.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Hi, folks. I don't know if you can hear me now, but Hank, I think that was a great question. And Isaac, I very much appreciated your presentation. And I wonder what this might look like in terms of using electricity for resiliency in 10 or 15 years. Now in Boston, we have the requirement to have 25% of parking spaces equipped with electric car chargers. And I wonder if that will begin to be something that can be bi-directional, not in the near term, but maybe in the longer term. So that's maybe one point that, may come up for discussion later on down the line. And I'm also wondering if, and I may put this to the group, if folks are dealing with the issue that was mentioned today with PHIUS wanting to see the RECs retained on site for passive house projects. So I'm beginning to try to decipher what this might mean for projects. So I'll put that question to the whole group if anybody has experience or feedback. Thank you.
I can start with the vehicle charging, which is right now, developers are really, we're seeing very little electric vehicle chargings go in, even though, you know, the tab is, the utility programs are covering up to 90% of the cost of installation. It's still just like another added piece of complexity that people are not adding to the already complex process of building a multifamily building. Some of the more progressive developers who enjoy the brain damage of new complicated things are wading into those murky waters, and most are avoiding it, I would say, right now. But you know, you can get up to, I think, 10 charging stations that get wired into the common area meter of the building. That does help. You've electrified something, which is transportation. So that adds this new load to common, which solar can offset. So there is a nice, you know, marriage there as one thing to consider. But then you try and model, like, how much power is this going to use every year? And that's a behavioral question, which is, are any of these tenants actually going to buy an electric vehicle if it's an affordable housing senior development? And my prediction is that there's not that many low-income seniors who are sprinting to buy a new electric vehicle right now. And again, we're coming up with different ways and financing solutions and car sharing and cool stuff. But, you know, those are all interesting problems to think about related to the electrification piece. But overall, it's happening. In 10 to 15 years from now, I could absolutely see the vehicle to grid application coming up, where you know, those charging stations are actually, once the utilities get their ducks in a row and figure out how to monetize, or how to allow people to monetize the value to the grid of dumping power on and off at these locations, I think we'll start to see that. I think that's going to be most common in like big commercial fleets. Way before we see it at the, like, you know, multifamily passive house 10 meter or 10 kind of parking space type application. So I think that will, short answer is I think it will exist in the future, but for now there's you know, there's a lot more to figure out on that front. And I'll pause. Julie, it seemed like you had something on that front.
No, I mean, we've done a bunch of research on trying to find a car share opportunity for residents to use those EV, and that has a lot of challenges to it, but we are being forced to include, and I say forced gently, but we're being required to include EV parking spaces. And then, like you said, the infrastructure is paid for. So we're going to have those, but what is the likelihood that our residents or even staff are going to have electric cars? And so if we could come up with a way to do the EV charging car share, then I think it would be amazing. And Chicago's got something right now. That's our next kind of call on this, but not sure yet about, we have a perfect design opportunity for cars to be backup power if we put parking under the townhomes. But that's a project for the future, like you said. So yeah, because I just think that even the car charging is a little, I wish there were more charging stations, only because I have an electric car, but having them at affordable housing buildings or even market rate, I just don't know who uses them. And but you know, we'll be glad the infrastructure's in there when we all have an electric car.
And to Frank's second point, I wanted to invite Tom to maybe hop in, but just on the, you know, this question of which types of solar projects are actually qualifying and how is this REC stuff being enforced? As I mentioned, our experience has been mostly for 2015 to 2018. We've been focused on direct purchase as the compliance piece, and the kind of REC stuff has sort of not really been at the table. 2021, that's obviously going to change, but curious, Frank and I have a project right now where this is an issue for Passive House. So curious if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. Thanks, Frank. I think I would put this pretty squarely in Isaac, the category that you mentioned, where PHIUS is getting savvy too, but a few things are still up in the air about. So what we know for sure and what we're still unsure on, what we know for sure is that REC retirement requirement is in the PHIUS 0 language. So just for projects getting to net zero, and silent elsewhere. And so that's what we know.
And Tom, for a project that was going for 2018 PHIUS, would a power purchase agreement, a no cost option, fly in that circumstance to your knowledge, or would it have to?
That's what we've seen. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see, we're focused here obviously on Passive House and PHIUS. I think a lot of entities are going to have to quickly get up to speed on answering this question as we head to a net zero future, because we can't just pass the RECs around at some point, right? And so I think, municipalities and the state will need to answer the question of who needs to retain the RECs to actually count them towards their net zero requirements. PHI, interestingly, has currently a statement that they're agnostic about the RECs. New solar is a goal for them, and however you develop it.
So Tom and Isaac, what about offsite renewables? So, because the chart you put up, Tom, was ownership, but if I don't have a piece of land somewhere to build the other, 80 or 70 that I need, what are my opportunities to buy those? Can I use net metering? And do I get the full value of the net metering?
You can use it. Under PHIUS, you don't get the full value. You get a partial value, depending on whether that's an offsite system that you own or an offsite system that you're buying credit from versus like a national low quality REC, that was Isaac's example of the kind of worst case 20% value of those RECs, energy value. But you absolutely can use offsite to get to zero under PHIUS. You can as well with PHI, although it does, your options are a little bit more limited. It requires ownership. You're not buying credits at that point.
And Julie, just one distinction to make is net metering credits is a financial value. You'll get full value net metering credits if you participate in a community solar array, but buying net metering credits is just a financial transaction that does not come with the environmental attribute, which is a separate thing to buy effectively. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing that I'll add, especially relevant for someone like POA, is that a lot of developers I'm working with are starting to think about, like the one that I just mentioned who missed the boat on adding solar to this one building and now needs to kind of catch up on it, is adding solar to another new construction building down the road that's in kind of the same municipality. But if you have other projects that you're developing, you can avoid, it can technically be off-site, but on the site of another building that you're developing. And that can be one of the easier ways to meet that requirement.
Great, that's helpful.
Mike, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I came into the meeting late. Sorry, I don't have all the facts, but I heard about the discussion about not installing electric vehicle chargers at affordable housing. And I'd say two things about that. One is, at least in the state of Massachusetts, there is a stated goal of having 750,000 electrical vehicles on the road by 2030. That's an enormous number. There will need to be participation from all income sectors. The second is that if you preclude the installation of these chargers in multifamily housing, you preclude those people from being able to access those vehicles. A third point is that you don't need to buy a brand new electric vehicle. In fact, many people in affordable housing probably do not buy new cars. They buy used cars, and used electric vehicles are much less expensive. So I'd make the point that maybe you want to install at least the conduit and wiring for these chargers to make it easy, because if you don't do that, it becomes a much more expensive proposition following construction.
I will say just one point to that program is, while it is more expensive, the Eversource, what's called Make Ready program, covers what you just described as the expensive legwork, which is paying for all of the sort of site work and doing all that trenching and tying in. That's 100% covered by the Eversource program right now. What's not necessarily covered is the actual cost of the chargers themselves and the equipment. So there's a sort of cost sharing.
Yeah, it depends on if you're in an environmental justice location, which we have some projects that are in, and so that covers the cost of the actual chargers. And, you know, so we definitely will put them in, and don't expect our residents to buy Teslas brand new off the shelf, you know. We sort of want to get them, you know, set up. That's why we're thinking about the car sharing, because then they don't have to own and manage it. We can own it and just provide that as a, you know, as an option to use.
I guess the key point I'd make is that if the charger isn't there, someone cannot buy a car to use it. What do they do in a multifamily house building? There really isn't a good alternative.
It's barely a good alternative if you own a market rate condo in Cambridge and don't have off-street parking. So
Same
there's
problem.
a lot of charging issues that have not changed in the last 4 years when I first got my electric car. So, but this is a good step, because I think it's great to maybe provide a car, because we a lot of times are offered an opportunity to put in less parking spaces, which we prefer to do because it costs more to build a parking space. But a lot of times not all of our residents can even afford a car. So to the extent we provide a sharing option, and that happens to be an electric car, that's even better.
Julie,
All right. Go ahead.
sorry, just on that topic, Julie, I was going to ask the good to go. You know, I just saw the press release and kickoff for that this past weekend, but the car sharing program that I think is going to be launched at 2505 Washington, the joint development between POA and Nuestra. I don't know if I have all the facts right on that, but just curious if you have any familiarity there.
Well, that's that's actually could be Mattapan, or it could be the Bartlett project that I talked about at the beginning.
Right.
But both of those projects are getting the infrastructure, and Mattapan is not an environmental justice location. The other one might be. So one of them may be getting all the chargers as well.
Got it. Well, just to, I guess, share with others that what Frank brought up, that the Good to Go program that's being jointly funded by the nonprofit E for the Future and Mass CEC is trying to help figure out this car sharing with low income access with affordable rates for renting. That's going to go into a couple locations. I think is just getting kicked off. I know a few residents in our network on Boston who have done some test driving and have said that there's some good outlook on that, but there's some stuff to be figured out, which is like, what happens if the user doesn't plug it back in and it's not charged for the next one, and
Exactly.
just like the minutia of program implementation.
And even managing, we have enough to do to manage apartments. Managing a car share it's got to be easy for us to do it. So we'll figure it out.
All right, folks, we're finally starting to get some really good discussion here, and I know there's more hands up, but we're over time, so I'm going to have to cut it off tonight and be respectful of our speakers here and let them go. But thank you all for being here. This was a great discussion. We'll see you again here next month for the continuation of our Passive House Plus Renewables equals Net Zero Energy series. You can find out all the information on phmass.org of this session, past sessions, you can watch videos. But thank you to everyone for being here, and especially to Isaac and Abby, our future speakers. Thank you. Tremendous session. We'll see you next time.